everyone, and welcome to part 2 of History and Psychology. Where we left off, we were talking about behaviorism and how we learn through associations as well as consequences. Now, since these studies were conducted on animals largely, a lot of people didn't like the idea that humans can learn in the same way animals can, because we have this idea that humans are better and our processes are more advanced when sometimes there are similarities. And so, there was kind of a pushback against behaviorism, saying we're not automatons, we're not like other animals. We think, feel, and function in different ways. And that's what we see with the proliferation of humanism. Now, with humanism, some major players we see are Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers was very influential in leading the client-centered therapy approaches, talking about features of a therapist that are ultimately used across all paradigms today. Unconditional positive regard, so always seeing our clients in a good light. Empathy and understanding what they're going through, as well as genuineness. Not being fake, but truly caring for or being concerned about the client. These are ideas that have proliferated as a result. Excuse me, I'm just speaking too quickly. As a result of Carl Rogers. Now, humanism is this. The best way to remember this one is it's a push against kind of behaviorism. I think of it as like the hippie go free of psychology. It's very much about people are individuals. They have potential for good that's innate within all of them. And they really have to live up to that potential. And so if they're not living with their true self, there's going to be some discrepancies. And so humanism, if you are in a nursing field or plan to go in the nursing field, this chart is going to be like seared into your brain. The hierarchy of needs. So there's this idea that in order for humans to reach their full fulfillment, they have to have their other needs met. So physiological needs are at your base. These are your food, water, shelter, warmth, security. Are you safe? Do you have a home? Those types of things. Social needs. Whatever your social needs are they being met? Your esteem, your self-worth, accomplishment. If you have all of these, the idea is that you're reaching inner fulfillment. Now, when I learned about Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I thought this was like fulfillment for life. Like I thought once you earned fulfillment, you were always there. No, it's talking about fulfillment in different tasks. So that's why this is so interesting to me. But all humans have this potential for good. That's the focus of humanism. And so it's more like, we shouldn't break it down. We should have evidence-based practices. But we also have to realize the human nature to psychology. What do the people want? How do they feel fulfilled, safe? And so with those levels of fulfillment, I think I could best explain this as a homework assignment. So let's say you have a really hard homework assignment. You have to write a 10-page paper, and you are just feeling overwhelmed. Well, let's assess the situation in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maybe all of your physiological needs are being met. You're not hungry, you're not thirsty. Security, you're in your room, you're feeling pretty safe and good. Social needs, you hung out with your parental units, and you were like, you know what? I feel belong, I feel happy, I'm comfortable in my relationships. And your esteem, you're kind of feeling, maybe you're feeling a little busty crusty from this assignment. It's not making you feel too hot or too capable. So your esteem need isn't being met. And so in order to get that need met, you may do something else, right? If you've ever said, you know what, I'm going to go on TikTok for a little bit. That may be putting your esteem need back up so you have a sense of fulfillment. So sometimes those things that threaten our fulfillment, we're going to try to redirect them or satisfy them. So that's the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because that main focus is fulfilling ourselves and having that potential for good. Again, very like hippie go free. Like we are more than just behaviors, as according to behavioral psychologists. We are also our wants, our desires, and our needs. Then we have the cognitive revolution. Now, there's no particular psychologist I want to mention now, but Noam Chomsky was a linguist, and he had this idea that we have learning devices in our brain called a learning acquisition device that helps us learn language regardless of exposure. Well, research hasn't really supported this notion, but it's an interesting idea nonetheless. Cognitive psychologists look at all our thought processes. So thinking, memory, learning, different facets like that. This was influenced by research in linguistics. I think it was around the and computer science. So you could probably think like 60s to 80s, I want to say. Don't quote me on those years. But I use the imagery of the brain as a computer, so that's why I put the computer here, because we have all this input we're putting into our brain, which is our kind of like our hard drive. And so the cognitive revolution looks at, well, how do people function like computers? How can we pull out information like this? How can we remember certain things? How does that relate to attention? How does that relate to memory? How does it relate to cognitive capacity, intelligence? That's the cognitive revolution. And so this is where I stray a little bit from the text. I'm going to talk about feminist and multicultural psychology, because psychology previously was dominated by Western white heterosexual male academics. If you go through all of these people that were listed, they're all white male academics. And this can have issues because some of their perspectives, like Freud, they were based on, like, he would make theories off of stereotypes about women, hysteria, without actually testing things on women. And so they would test on their own group of Western white heterosexual male academics. Well, what's the issue with that? We're not accounting for people outside of these groups. Women, people of color, even homosexual psychologists, people who fall within the LGBTQ umbrella. And so we needed to expand this, and, even when I was going through my undergrad, we didn't focus as much on feminist and multicultural psychologists. And so you'll see I have some pictures of Cecil Sumner here, the first African-American to receive a PhD in psychology. And then we have Mamie Phipps Clark and Kenneth Clark, and they had really eye-opening research on race. And I listed that critique. I'm going through my brain to make sure I addressed all points. But they had some great research called the Clark-Doll test in 1954. You may have heard about this, but it's talking about internalized racism. And this was used in the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case. And if you don't know what that is, it was the case lobbying for the desegregation of schools based on the color of the student's skin. And so the Clark-Doll test in 1954 was basically asking children, namely children of color, which doll was better. They would have a white doll and a black doll. And they would ask the students, which doll is beautiful? Which doll is bad? Which doll is good? They would ask them these questions, and they found that children associated the bad terms with the black doll, but also associated their identity with the black doll. And so it called the question, systemic racism in our country and why we have a need for the desegregation of schools. It's a really eye-opening test, but I've included a link to a brief YouTube video if you wanted to check it out. Hispanic and Latinx influences in psychology. So Oklahoma State University has a great webpage with a bunch of people listed. So you can click that here. But I just wanted to bring up some notable names. So Santiago Ramon y Cajal, he was very important for psychobiology, which we're going to talk about coming up. But he talked about the structure of the central nervous system. So basically, how do our neurons communicate with one another? Not as interconnected parts, but as discrete and autonomous cells. And this was huge for setting off a bunch of research into the neuron. So this is a huge influence that we don't talk about very often. It paved the way for many psychological fields, including clinical psychology, neurobiological, and comparative. Comparative psychology looks at the differences between humans and other animals. And Martha Bernal, she was the first woman of Mexican descent to earn a PhD in clinical psychology in the U.S. in 1962. So there are a lot of barriers back then, right? And she was essential and early advocate for multicultural psychology, so looking at different cultural experiences and how they affect someone's, I don't want to say life because it's very general, but how the experience of being a person of color affects someone's life and how they have future experiences. And so she basically analyzed the issue that we have with curriculum in schools and looking at how we have this problem of psychology being dominated by white Western heterosexual male academics and addressing the problems in our curriculum that kind of perpetuate that notion. So she moved to be more inclusive in how we're learning to, assess people and how we seek to understand their backgrounds and how those backgrounds inform their present experiences in terms of their culture. So very, very important work. And then I have some women in psychology. I found a Very Well Mind resource that has a good list of a bunch of prominent women in psychology, but some notable names I pulled out. Anna Freud. So she was Sigmund Freud's daughter. Okay. And to me, for some reason, this may just be a bias, but I feel like she was better than Freud because she expanded psychodynamic psychology so much, and I would say it's more substantiated, the things that she claimed, because she looked at child psychology as a field and psychotherapy. So looking at those childhood experiences in focusing on children. So that's really interesting as opposed to working with just adults. Karen Horney, feminine psychology. I just feel like judging from this picture, I know stereotypes, I wouldn't mess with her. But Karen Horney was really involved in like studying feminist psychology as well as sex studies in psychology. You know, different things like, you know, what arouses people. There's a whole slew of things we can talk about with that. But she was kind of funny in that she coined the term womb envy because Freud had a term called penis envy. Long story short, Freud said that all women were inherently unbalanced because they were jealous of men that they don't have penises. Okay. So you see why a lot of people don't respect Freud sometimes. And so Karen Horney was kind of like, yeah, well, if you want to play that game, men have womb envy because they can't have babies. And so she kind of countered Freud like that. I just feel like she'd be a person I'd want to have lunch with. Because that's so funny. So she published works that were focused on the socialization of women in society. So looking at how we kind of reinforce these different behaviors that women are kind of forced into or abide by based on their gender and their gender role. And so she was the first to kind of address how we socialize women in society to do certain things. And so it's really impactful studies. And then Melanie Klein is the last picture. She was revolutionary in changing play therapy and using child analysis, so looking at children. But children, it's kind of hard to do a psychotherapy session with a child, right? Because they're going to tell you everything under the sun, and there's no direction, and they go on tangents like me. But play therapy is a great approach because it's the idea that we can get children to utilize therapeutic approaches in their play. And this is something that's used today. So making games out of therapy interventions. I found some great videos online for my abnormal class concerning this. But that is really important and often used today. So just some notable women I wanted to mention. And the last little section I'm going to mention briefly is diversity of topics and foci within psychology. In Unit 1, I have a link that will show you the APA's web page concerning this topic. But there are so many different applications and interests. This is just a basic, really quick highlight. I think there's like 60 to 80 divisions within psychology, but you have biopsychology and evolutionary psychology, sensation and perception. So looking at how we feel, touch, taste, hear things, and also looking at how we perceive them. Because a sensation could be, both of us could smell popcorn, but our perception could be, you think it smells good and I think it smells like crap because I don't like the smell of popcorn, right? So sensation and perception. Cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, how someone develops throughout the lifespan. Personality psychology, social psychology, the individual and within how they communicate with groups. Clinical psychology, industrial organizational psychology, health psychology. You can even look at like health systems. So looking at power dynamics between nurses and doctors, that's a part of psychology. Sport and exercise psychology, forensic psychology, and the list goes on. So it's really interesting to see the history of psychology, where it's kind of rooted and how it is expanded off of these main paradigms to go into all of these different facets. So you may look at social psychology and maybe someone leans more towards a behaviorist type of perspective. But maybe someone looks at social psychology and they lean more towards a psychodynamic perspective. right? So it's really interesting to see how we have all of these deviations, and we're going to explore that throughout the semester. And that's it for this video. I hope you all have a great week.